Welcome everyone to this mini lecture on Father José Granados' book, Sacramental Theology, Introduction to Sacramental Theology, Chapter 9, entitled Sign and Cause of Grace, subtitled The Sacraments and the Medieval Synthesis. So, another thing I really love about this book is that he takes us through a historical survey of the development of doctrine within sacramental theology all the way up until modern times, the present. And so in the past we saw him taking us through the Augustinian notion of sign and this concept within sacramental theology. And here for the medieval synthesis in the Middle Ages, especially with high scholastic theology, we see how St. Augustine's theology is taken to new levels. And in general, we're looking at the distinction and complementarity between the kind of philosophy involved in the work of St. Augustine, and that is primarily, we'd say, Platonic. Influenced by Neoplatonism in the early centuries after the time of Jesus. In the early church, many church fathers influenced by the philosophy of Plato, and this Platonic sensibility that tends toward abstraction, immaterial forms, and things of spirit, over and against matter, you could say. Whereas with St. Thomas Aquinas, though he quotes Augustine thousands of times in his work, we have a renaissance of the philosophy of Aristotle. So we can call it Aristotelian. And this is a greater appreciation of matter in relation to form. So it's more of a balanced metaphysics, balanced what's called ontology or science of being with St. Thomas Aquinas, even than what we have with St. Augustine, though St. Augustine is quite good and reliable. But it's more of a question where they're putting the accent on things. And in scholastic theology, which is the stuff of St. Albert, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, the Franciscan, John Duns Scotus, also Franciscan, and so many great theologians at this time in the 13th century, and or even with Anselm of Canterbury, the Benedictine, in the 11th century before. These kinds of figures, but especially in the academy as the universities develop, that we have the development of the university professor, you could say, especially as staffed by the new mendicant orders, the Dominicans and Franciscans, but many contributed to this university life. But the scholastic theology develops in the great theological syntheses of this era. So this is what Granados is recounting in this chapter 9, and there's so many good things here. So, is a sacrament a sacred sign? We have to be careful with the meaning of sign. So he plunges us into the classic debates, one of the 9th century, so going back to the 800s, between Paschasius Radbertus and another guy named Ratramnus. Now this is monastic theology. These Dominican monks are having it out between what exactly is true about the Eucharist, for example, in terms of sign and or symbol and or presence. So we've already been introduced to the classic distinction, res et sacramentum. And the sacrament is both the res, the divine life channeled through the sacrament, divine presence, grace, we say in a word, is the res. The sacramentum is the rite, the ritual, the matter and form, everything required canonically for the sacrament to be valid, and all the signification of it, all the meanings there. But we have all of this network, this matrix of sacramentum, through which the res is delivered to the human soul for the salvation of the person, beginning with baptism. So these debates, the 9th century and then in the 11th century between Berengar and Lanfranc, we need to know who are the orthodox ones and who are the heterodox ones. So the orthodox ones, Paschasius Radbertus, 5 stars. Yes, he was right. And Ratramnus was wrong. Then we have Lanfranc was right and Berengar was wrong. So he takes us through these debates, and on page 139, in the Eucharist, the body of Christ, Paschasius argues, is present, both in truth and in figure. So this doctrine of the real presence of Christ is getting solidified, even back to the 9th century, the 800s, is getting solidified through these debates. So the Eucharist is a figure in which we encounter the truth of the risen body of Jesus. The body is there in truth because it is really present. It is there in figure because in a dynamism of expansion toward its ecclesial fullness, what it means for those of us who receive it. So he goes over Ratramnus' heterodox position, page 194, and in his argument, Granados writes, the figure excludes the truth, departs from the patristic concept of sacrament. For a sign is understood in Ratramnus, the heterodox position, as something more distant, without realizing that there is a corporeal sign which not only points toward the person, but contains him in all his richness. Okay, so, and then page 195, it's not that the sign is meant to be like an arrow that points to a target far off somewhere else, but the sacramental sign is something that is signifying what is made present in reality. The sign signifies in figure what is being made present in reality. So where the sacrament is, the reality to which it signifies is there, is given. And there's where we have the doctrine of the real presence. In the Eucharist, it's a sacrament because in it the body of Jesus is made present and active. Christ, the man, is the revelation of God, and at the same time, true God in the flesh. So it goes back to the very incarnation of Jesus. And Berengar's heresy, we read about on page 195, that sign arrow or sign reflection of a reality, is really a proto-Protestant position. And Berengar also maintained the supremacy of Scripture. So we're seeing this Lanfranc-Berengar debate anticipating the Protestant Reformation that would take off in the 16th century because of the invention of the printing press, when ideas could then circulate. And so already in the 1000s or the 11th century, we have rumblings of Reformation that would come down the road. And the Protestant doctrines have their roots here. We would say they're very shallow sacramental roots. And that's why they tend not to have the 7 sacraments. So, page 196, thinking about the logic of incarnation, and in the Eucharist, on the altar we find a sign. Yes, but a sign in which Jesus himself is made really present. This confirms that the language of the body underlies the logic of the sacraments. For the body is not only the expression, but also the active presence of the person, who is encountered in the body and not beyond it. So the sacramentality of the human body is key to understanding what we mean by a sacred sign of the sacrament. That not only do we have an expression or signification of the person through the body, but an active presence of the person. And so in the Eucharist and all the sacraments, not only do we have a signification of Christ, but we have an active presence of Christ there. And so the Council of Trent would go on then in the 16th century in response to the Protestant Reformation to define the Eucharist as the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, of Jesus, the incarnate Word, the God-man, is there in full. But at the same time, there is the sacramentum. So it's not that we find the leg of Jesus there, the arms, the hair, the heart. Yes, there are Eucharistic miracles on occasion. But in general, we still have the real presence of Christ delivered through the sacramentum. So it's appropriate for eating and appropriate for that intimate communion and encounter with Christ. So we have both the res and the sacramentum in every sacrament. So thinking about the Eucharist especially, which is the centerpiece of all 7 sacraments, as Granados argues, the Eucharistic body is a sign of the historical body of Jesus, which died on the cross and rose again from the tomb, and a sign of the resurrected body that is promised to the Christian when he feeds on the Eucharist. So it's also the sign of the body of the church. That's how it's sacramentum. It's still a sign pointing to the historical body of Jesus, the resurrected body of Jesus, and the mystical body of the church, which in this way there's signification going on that encompasses all of these mysteries of the faith. But at the same time, it's not only a sign of these things as sacramentum, but the real presence of Jesus that involves his historical body, his resurrected body, the unity of the body of the church is delivered precisely in and through the sacrament. So this is just beautiful, tremendous. And the bottom of page 197, more of the scholastic terminology, sacramentum tantum, when we're kind of dissecting what we mean by the different aspects of the sacrament. We have the sacrament alone, the sacramentum et res, the both res and sacrament. We have the res tantum, the res alone we can think about. And we go on page 198 and following of all these important distinctions within sacramental theology. So this is really important to know in understanding the medieval treatment of the sacraments, all this terminology, which I could talk about more, but for the sake of time, I'll just refer back to these pages. And then we have on page 201 this important distinction that goes back to Aristotle, especially between matter and form. There's no matter without form. There are forms without matter in the abstract, in the world of ideas, and in the case of, in the sense of matter that's composed of atoms and subatomic particles, yes, an angel is form without matter. God, by way of analogy, is certainly form without matter. And so this is an important metaphysical distinction that's then applied through, again, the Renaissance of Aristotelian philosophy in the 13th century with St. Thomas Aquinas et alia, that they're thinking about what is the proper matter and form of each of the 7 sacraments. And so then we have this whole discussion on this in the next several pages of Granados. But page 202, for example, the sacrament, the form of the sacrament is the formula. That is the words pronounced in the sacrament, distinct from the things used in the rite. On the other hand, the form denotes the entire ritual structure. For example, They say that the sacraments of the heretics are valid if they are celebrated according to the correct form of the church, in recta forma or in forma ecclesiae. He'll go on to talk about this topic more in his book later, where you have heterodox communities of Christians that are not in union with the Pope and the full Catholic Church, but as long as there's the correct form, at least with certain sacraments, they're valid. Like baptism, for example. That's why the Catholic Church recognizes a baptism with the Trinitarian formula to be valid, even in any Protestant church that has the Trinitarian, the form in place and the matter in place. The term matter indicates, in general, the entire visible substrate of the celebration: rituals, words, things, the material stuff of the sacrament, whether the chrism, as in confirmation, or the water, as in baptism, the bread and wine become body and blood of Christ in Eucharist. So matter and form, also really important to know about within sacramental theology. And then the final main section of this chapter, efficacious signs of grace, the causality of the sacraments. So in metaphysics, this philosophy, classical metaphysical philosophy, we're always asking, what is the cause of a thing? When we ask, why does such and such exist, we're inquiring into the cause of the thing. Because when we ask the question, why, we tend to respond in English, because, Why is the sky blue? Because, and we explain that question in terms of natural science, for example. But we want to inquire into the causality of the sacraments, and what was the cause. So footnote 38, for example, goes back quoting the Franciscan St. Bonaventure, who's referencing the 4 kinds of causes talked about by Aristotle: efficient, material, formal, and final. If you want to learn more about these things, I wrote a little book. This is why I wrote it, to help explain it. It's understandable. A little book called Metaphysics, subtitled A Basic Introduction and a Christian Key. So in that book I talk about the 4 causes. In another book on the work of St. Edith Stein I wrote, Human and Divine Being, I talk in way more depth about the 4 causes. But applying the 4 causes to the sacramental phenomenon, a sacrament, page 205, is a sign of a form that bears the image and is a cause. So this is quoting Peter Lombard, who wrote before St. Thomas Aquinas and is famous for his work called the Sentences. And Thomas Aquinas and many other scholastic theologians wrote commentaries on Peter Lombard's work called the Sentences. And so he insists, Lombard, that the sacraments were instituted not only to signify but also to sanctify. It's a good way to put it. Page 207, the key to the causality of the sacrament is the action accomplished by Jesus himself, especially in his cross and resurrection. So the believer receives in the sacrament the benefits of that action. So the cause of the sacrament is the paschal mystery of Jesus, always. At the same time, we better understand that formula, ex opere operato, from the work worked. It's a key term, because what we're saying here is just in simply the performance of the sacrament, God operates, God works. Ex opere operato. And it doesn't depend on the morality of the minister. It doesn't depend on the disposition of the person receiving it. That's ex opere operantis. We can talk about that also. But the ex opere operato, God gives totally himself in the sacrament every time when we have the proper matter, proper form, proper minister, proper recipient, and these aspects of canon law. When all this is there, we have God acts. It's guaranteed. It's God wills to act in the sacrament, because the causality goes back to the action accomplished by Jesus himself in his cross and resurrection. But the sacraments save because of the work performed by Jesus. But the sacrament introduces the recipients into the action of Christ, who is the one who secures the grace. So the sacrament is a channel of grace. St. Thomas Aquinas on page 209 talks about the instrumental causality of the sacraments as channels of grace. Even with Christ's humanity, his human nature is the first instrument of salvation, what St. Thomas calls instrumentum conjunctum, conjoined instrument. So the seven sacraments as instrumental causes prolong this radical instrument that is the Lord's body. So well put for us to understand what's going on in the sacraments. If you allow me just a couple more points in terms of things I starred in my text. I just have to mention these and then wrap up this short presentation. So indeed Christ's flesh, page 210, is the instrument of our salvation, for its corporeal actions and passions work with the divine power to banish sin and death. So Christ's flesh, his human nature, is the instrument of salvation. But then thinking about the causality of the sacrament is the proper causality of the body, in the first place of the body of Christ, and then based on it of the material elements of the rites. For example, the water, bread, wine, oil, which are assimilated in some way to this body of Jesus. Given that the Eucharist contains the presence of the Lord's body itself, it is the principle of the efficacy of the other sacraments. So the Eucharist, Granados argues, is the principle of efficacy of all the other six sacraments, because the Eucharist contains the presence of the Lord's body itself, and so vivifies the causality of that sacred humanity of Christ into the other six sacraments. So it happens in baptism, for example, where the water which had been touched by Jesus in the Jordan, and in his own baptism by St. John the Baptist, transmits to us the touch of Christ's body, configuring us to him so that grace might be poured out on us. So St. Thomas relies also on our ordinary experience, footnote 57. Does the body not transmit spiritual realities as when the voice communicates ideas? So the act of speaking and hearing the speech is a corporeal instrument to circulate, communicate ideas that are themselves invisible. So it's a good analogy for the phenomenality of the sacrament, you could say. So finally, page 212, the body, hinge of salvation. The body not only a sign of a presence in the sacrament, but also materializes it. Only in the body do we encounter the person and enter into relation with him. The corporeal sign is ipso facto, fact in itself, efficacious. So, wow. Okay. Trying to just track along with Granados in his excellent book, Introduction to the Sacramental Theology. This great chapter on the medieval synthesis. Thanks so much for following along with me.